Hiding me. I think I'll just hit, got it. It's not letting me click it.
I knew that, it wouldn't be right. There we go.
Thanks, Ben.
Sorry.
So I will just preface my comments by saying that the broader study of Manila Galleons has something for everybody sort of in cultural resource. I mean, it has, we might not talk about everything tonight, but the area of scholarship for those who like documents, the Spanish kept amazing documents of the galleon trade and not just in the Pacific, but all of their seafaring. If you are an architectural historian, there's shipwreck, ship construction technology that you can get into. There's a whole gamut of historical period artifacts that you can study, and many secondary sources that you can use to do that. And if you are coming purely from an archaeological background, then what I have to offer is, if you go out this door and go down, there's a corner bar right down the street. So, no, I kid, of course. Archaeologists often know what to do with the glass in their hands. So I wanted to just give you a brief introduction on how I came to be involved with this project. I was graduating from San Jose State, and my professor, Dr. Manichetti, invited me and the other grad student who was moving on that year, Chris Avery, to join him at an Explorers Club meeting. And it was in some museum, I forget what it was, in the Presidio of San Francisco. And I was introduced at that dinner to Ed von der Porten. And Ed von der Porten was a scholar, an educator, a writer, an archaeologist, and one of the most enthusiastic people I've ever met when it comes to history. And Ed was the main force behind the Manila Galleon project in Baja, which started about 1999, 2000. He was also involved in the other two wrecks that are on the west coast of the United States, the one at Drake's Bay and the one that's in northern Oregon, also called the Beeswax wrecks. He tried to support all those in his retirement, and he did an amazing job. We lost Ed in 2018, and unfortunately, that and COVID and drug trafficking have made it very difficult for the Mexican team and the American team to coordinate continuing site visits. So I believe it's been since 2018 that nobody has visited the site, unfortunately. So I'm going to start out with a little background to make sure everybody understands what I'm talking about when I say Manila Galleon, because it's surprisingly not as well studied. A lot has happened in the last 20 years, not because of what necessarily we did, but because I think the interest in global economy and global history has really taken off, and it's become a much broader field recently. So when I say Manila Galleon, what I'm talking about is a trade system that developed between New Spain, or what present-day Mexico, and Manila, which is the capital of the Philippines in Asia, Southeast Asia. The origins of the Manila Galleon are multifaceted, and they start with the early period knowledge that that the Western world began to accumulate in the early modern period, starting about 1150. Information brought back from the what was then called the Orient or Southeast Asia, from folks like Marco Polo in the 13th century, and several others. Overland routes were developed. There was certainly a growing knowledge of Asian products, Asian culture, particularly connected to Persia and the Mediterranean. Once the age of exploration happened, though, and we had better ships, and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch particularly started venturing further and further, they eventually made landfall and began moving some of these products back and forth from Europe proper and Southeast Asia, most commonly around the Horn of Africa through the Indian Ocean, a very long and circuitous route. The other origins of the Manila Galleon trade have to be focused on the early settlement of the Caribbeans, because of the Spanish were looking for a way to get to the Asian islands without having to do that long trip around Africa. So they sailed west after the knowledge of, you know, the geometry of the earth and the geography of the earth, you know, made that a realistic possibility. They had better ships to do it in. So they sailed west, and of course they ran into the West Indies. That's, you know, where the name comes from. They eventually, you know, settled the Caribbean. That led to the Spanish conquest of Central America, Mexico, 1590, 1521. And that conquest, once the Mexican colony was well established, then they basically completed what they had set out to do by creating a trade system that went from Acapulco to Manila, which would then get the Asian goods to the New World. And then from there, they could be distributed in the New World, but also shipped overland to Veracruz, and then shipped back to Europe. So when the term Manila Galleon really refers only to the ships that were in this part of the trade. Once they got to the Atlantic Ocean, they're really not part of the Manila Galleon trade system. The Manila Galleon trade system started in 1565 and lasted for 200 years. Amazing. 1 to 2 ships per year would make this trip. On the westbound trip, they were taking silver, basically mined from South America, Central America, which was desired by the Chinese merchants, highly prized. So those ships would take those precious metals and some European goods and some goods made in New Mexico, made in the Mexican colony, the Spanish colony, and they would trade those once they got to Manila, and buy with that the Asian goods that were so desired by the Western world. 1 to 2 ships per year to make the trip. Took about 14 months, about 4 months on the way over, sometimes 6 to 8 on the way back, because you have the prevailing winds in your favor on the way from Acapulco to Manila. You do not have them in your favor on the return trip. So you had to go much further north, much colder weather, much stormier weather, all the way to North America, and then slide, as the picture shows, slide down the west coast, which is also not easy, back down to Acapulco. Then they had this big fair, and everybody, all the merchants would come, and they would do their trading in Acapulco. That trade lasted, as I said, for 250 years. 26 to 30 lost in that time is really actually pretty good. 12 were lost without a trace. Some of them were taken as prizes by other countries. But the 4 wrecks that we know of that are absolutely confirmed or close to being absolutely confirmed as units of the Manila Galleon trade include the 4 stars on this map, basically. 1 on the southern coast of Saipan, and then 3 on the North American coast. The site that I have been involved with was A on this. It's the Baja California wreck, but the other 2 have great stories and great assemblages as well, as does C, the Concepcion. So on the West Coast, we focus on these 3 wrecks. The beeswax wreck, which is the Burgos wreck, crashed in 1693 in northern Oregon. You may have remembered that there was a couple of new finds recently. Jim Delgado, who spoke just recently at this, in this room, was involved with the recovery of some timbers that were washed up in sort of a cove that they finally pulled out and tested. And it looks pretty clear that they were date to that time. So they could be parts of that ship. The San Augustine 1595, that's in Drake's Bay. It's totally protected. It's in the Point Reyes National Monument. Very well documented. The crew actually survived that wreck, unlike the beeswax wreck, where really nobody ever made it back to tell the tale. You know, they interacted potentially with the Native Americans, but in Drake's Bay, the crew survived and took small boats and actually made it all the way back to Acapulco. So they were able to tell the story. They told exactly where the wreck was. They also had interactions with the Miwok Indians and archaeological sites, indigenous sites from both of those areas and the Baja wreck. You can find shards of porcelain and other ceramics that the Native Americans have repurposed for stone tool technology, basically. The third wreck, and the one that I'm going to be discussing, is the Baja wreck, San Juanillo or San Juan. I'll explain why there's some discrepancy there in a minute. But that wreck, we're almost certain no one survived. It doesn't mean they didn't interact with the Native Americans, but no one got back to explain what might have happened. The journey east was difficult. Most of the ship's cargo, right, was made to make money. So we don't know how well the ships were even provisioned. It could be that they hit a storm and were not able to recover and ran out of food and just basically died before the ship ever made it to shore. And then it just foundered and ended up being destroyed by natural forces. So the stoneware of the galleons, I have to talk about the definition of stoneware for a second, because when I talk about stoneware, I don't mean porcelain. Porcelain has its own category, and there's a lot of scholarship that goes into porcelain because it's pretty sexy. You know, it's all hand, you know, from the 16th century, of course, it's all hand painted. It's gorgeous. I'll show you some pictures. I'm not an expert in that. Ed was an expert in that. And Roberto Junco, who edited the volume that Pat referenced, is an expert on it. And he's been to Acapulco, where there's just shards of this stuff, right? After 250 years of a market where they traded this stuff, there is so much porcelain in the ground, it's not even funny. So I don't mean to talk about porcelain, and I also don't mean earthenware, like what you might find in some, you know, pioneer areas where basically people, you know, find some clay and they low fire it and it becomes a utilitarian jar, but it's porous. It doesn't hold water, not for long, but there's some utility to it. Stoneware is fired high enough where essentially, like porcelain, it turns into glass. So it's entirely non-porous. So you can store water in it for a long time. And it's durable enough, and some of it is, you know, 3/4 of an inch thick. And these jars that basically were used as shipping containers for the porcelain and the silks and foodstuffs, rice, water, tea, that were also traded and used to provision ships. These were so incredibly durable, it's entirely possible that they lasted for 40 or 50 years. Which makes dating an assemblage from a shipwreck very difficult, because you have this, you know, this utilitarian jar that has a long lifespan. They can't really be dated by the motifs or the symbols on them. I mean, there are some porcelains, right, from the Ming Dynasty. You turn it over, and it looks just like it did the day it got put on the ship, even from our wreck site. And on the bottom, it's stamped with something that clearly shows it's from the Ming Dynasty, right, which would put it well within the realm of the dates we have in mind. Sometimes the painting is really elaborate. Sometimes it's the same motif, but not done as well. So there's a lot of things you can talk about when it comes to porcelain. Stoneware, and I'll just give you a kind of a rundown on what it's like at the Baja Rec site before I go on to the details of the stoneware collection. This picture in the lower left-hand side is a picture of the site. A couple of people on survey. This is a very desolate area. You have to take a boat to get there from a different part of the shore. It's not accessible, by just walking. And if you did walk it and you could get there, it would be a really long way. So when we go there on a day-to-day basis, we have to leave the hotel before sunrise, take a car ride of about 20 minutes, get on a boat that lasts about a half an hour. Then we have to disembark in the dunes and then walk another 2 or 3 miles before we really get there. So this is a long ways away from anything. And it makes the cost of doing an expedition pretty high. But that's what it looks like. Unfortunately, it's also an area where there's a lot of flotsam and jetsam that have come ashore. So there's trash everywhere, broken light bulbs and things that have fallen off ships. And as I said, it's also desolate enough that it attracts drug runners and stuff like that. And we have found those sorts of things, which the Mexican authorities have just told us to just get away from, stay away from, and we do. Here are some other pictures from either the site or of the artifacts, in addition to the stoneware that we have dealt with since 1999, when Ed von der Porten found some photographs in a news report from some site in Mexico. And he was able to, because he was such a scholar, tell just from the photographs that it was likely 16th century pottery. Where did it come from? Well, Manila Galleon crash site was a reasonable possibility. He did some research, got in touch with the people who actually found it, the beachcombers, basically, Americans that went down there and combed the beaches and looked for all kinds of stuff. He found them, and they developed a partnership, and they were involved to a point. And Ed got the Mexican government involved because it is a pretty important site. And once they got on board fully, the avocationalists were invited back to some degree, but it did start to change to where the government wanted to have mostly credentialed archaeologists come from the American side. But they were never pushy about it. It just was their preference. Just to basically, continue to apply professional standards to what they were doing. So in the upper left-hand corner is a boat similar. That's us disembarking on the site every morning when we did that. It was always nice being soaking wet first thing in the morning when you were gonna go out into the desert. Fortunately, you dried off pretty quick because the wind is a minimum 15 to 20 miles an hour all the time. And you've really got to cover your skin to be safe most of the day. The second picture to the right of that is some metal detecting and some survey that's going on. The picture to below the first one on the left-hand side, the middle picture, that's a block of beeswax, which was also part of the cargo. I saw a presentation a couple years ago at the SHA where some graduate students had tested it for pollen residue, and they sourced, excuse me, they sourced the pollen to Indonesia, Java in particular. So that's probably where that came from. And there's a significant amount of beeswax that has been recovered, but most of the big blocks have already been collected. Apparently the beeswax wreck in northern Oregon has considerably more, hence the name. So the metal object, second from the left in the middle, is a sounding lead used to test the depth from probably a small boat or from the galleon itself. It's only about that big. So it's not, doesn't weigh very much. But it's done in a European style, likely made on the ship. The next to that, to the right, is a polychrome porcelain fragment, likely imported first from Japan to China, then resold in Manila. That's definitely a Chinese, excuse me, a Japanese motif and a Japanese execution. The true porcelain on the lower left-hand side is very Chinese in motif, monkeys in a tree. And that's actually a really nice piece. But there are thousands of them, you know. You literally, when you walk on this beach, you just have to get in a big line and move across and put your pin flags because everything's laying right on the surface. So we do that, several sweeps, you know, over the first couple of days, and the collection starts a little bit later, but it's all done pretty systematically. The picture second to the left on the lower column is a cloisonne. If you're familiar with cloisonne, it's the only piece that's been found. We don't know what that means, you know, whether they didn't think it was going to be a hot seller, so they didn't buy much of it, or if it just was, you know, that more of it hasn't been found. But when 1,900 shards of porcelain are found in one cloisonne, you have to draw conclusions that that was just not a big part of the cargo. To the next to that is a metal object. It's a incense burner cap with a dragon motif, clearly Chinese, based on the scholarship that's been done. And in the lower left-hand corner is a Spanish coin that was minted in the New World with a design that dates and is commensurate with our idea of late 16th century shipwreck. Upper right-hand corner, there's a Mexican team archaeologist. They wore uniforms. We could really tell who they were. Just, you know, checking out an artifact in the sand. And the test unit is in the upper row as well. You know, over the years, there's been a lot of test units done, but the amount of artifacts recovered from test units is fractional. So imagine, if you will, that whatever happened, the artifacts are really in the same layer. Okay. And what we've tried to do is ask experts to come down, geologic experts, and explain how the sand moves, you know, why 1 year we can pick up everything, and then the next year we go back and we were right there and we didn't see it, you know, so something's moving. But when we do test units, we don't find much below like 15 inches. You know, the heavier objects tend to fall a little bit deeper. Coins, for example, we found coins in holes about that deep, just on metal detecting, and then you just go right down on it, and then you have a wand, and if it keeps going off, you keep digging, and you might find it, or you might find a light bulb base, which is more common. So the stoneware. When I came into the project and was agreed to be the analyst, Ed Vonderpoort and I drove down to Encinitas, where the collection was held. And in the early days, they used to bring it back to the United States and then return it. Made the study of it a little easier, but by that time that had changed, and you had to go to Encinitas. Not Encinitas, Ensenada. I'm sorry, my daughter lives in Encinitas, so I get them confused. Ensenada. And so we went down there, and at the time, it was just, you know, 10 or 12 boxes full of bags with artifact numbers stuck on them with those little sticky things. And nothing had been done with them so far. So basically what we did is we got 4 or 5 tables in this little museum that they gave us this room, and we spread everything out, and we just started matching color and matching design motifs, until we had everything broken down to about 12 categories. And some of them were, you know, not very well represented. Just some of the categories had 3 shards. You know, I remember this one, it had, if you looked at it in profile, it had white and black, and a black stripe down the middle. It looked like a reverse Oreo cookie on the side. And they were just 3 excellent examples of it, but there were only 3. And you can't tell how big the jar was. You know, how many jars does that really represent? So does it represent 3 jars, or is it 3 shards from the same jar? we didn't really know, but we had to make some call. There's another picture of the site and folks on survey down in the bottom. And that's a dragon jar fragment on the right-hand side, which had already previously been sourced to South China. So I said this was a big area, and this map shows the distribution of both porcelain shards and stoneware shards. I apologize, can't really blow it up very much more. But the red dots are the stoneware and the green dots are the porcelain. The porcelain represents almost 2,000 dots or groups of dots. And the stoneware only about 426 at the time. This would have been about 2016 when we had to start, we had to basically cut off the statistical analysis because we were preparing for the Dallas SHA conference where we were going to present all these papers. So we had to cut it off, and that's where the numbers were at the time. The numbers are higher now. So you can see up on the left here, site 2 and site 1 in the same map, north to the top. So given the tractor current that we're all well aware of, the crashed ship or the broken ship must have come ashore to the north of that red box. And over the intervening hundreds of years, the current and the wind has just pushed everything that much further every year, that much further every year, to the point where it's like 10 or 12 well, in miles, about 10 miles apart from the top to the bottom. So covering that in a survey when you've got 10 people is difficult. And then going back a second time to collect it all, it can be pretty exhausting. But that's the distribution. I get tired just looking at it because when you get out of the boat, I wish I had a pointer. You get out of the boat about right there.
I'll use your cursor.
Yeah, I can use the cursor, yeah. You get out of the boat about right here. And then this is a very turbulent area. You really just start going this way. And this is sometimes underwater and sometimes it isn't. Most of the times it is. And then we continue up here because the thinking was that if we focused our efforts around here, we'd find other things. And sure enough, all the metal objects are in a much tighter grouping because they're heavier. They don't get blown or they go down faster into the sand. So that is probably where the ship came ashore, but we have yet to confirm the ballast pile or any ship timbers. I think we have enough magnetometer surveys and ground penetrating radar where that's likely the location. But checking it out, and it's in the surf, so it makes scuba really hard. You can't really scuba dive in 5 feet of water. You know, it's dangerous and it doesn't work very well. And as the tide changes, then your methods have to change. They've tried it with Pongas, which is the name of that little boat, with hookah systems, and it didn't work. I was never involved with any of the diving, but the years that they've tried it, it was non-productive. So very frustrating. But we have the artifacts to deal with, and that's just as important. If you imagine a jar that's about this big, okay, these stoneware jars, I'm gonna shoot one up. I'm gonna shoot a picture of one for you real quick. Okay, this is what we're talking about. Okay, we're talking about large vessels. They can, some of them can be smaller, you know, given the diameter of the mouth, they're clearly smaller, but these are huge. I mean, these can stand this tall. You know, 1,000 liters of water, for example. And so that's what we're talking about. And they would put all these commodities in these storage vessels and then stack these in the hull of the ship. And they were so durable that they would last. Obviously, they weren't shipwreck proof because all we have is fragments of them. But in terms of durability, these things are like amazing. So let's go back. So now you can really imagine those jars, right? Big, wide mouth jars of enormous size. When we segregated them by either the rim type, you know, the shard, is it a rim? Does it have the top part? Does it have the little neck part? You know, that was very small. We only had a few of those, and each one we got a diameter off of just by drawing a picture of it and doing a quick measurement, and that data has all been recorded. But we don't have very many of those. The shoulder is the part that kind of flattens out after the neck, but before you get to the widest portion. And that's where those ears are, those little tie downs. Because they used to have wooden, sometimes ceramic lids, and then you would tie a rope and secure it over the top to these little hooks, these little round ears, they call them. And that's how you would close it. And so on the shoulder, that's called the shoulder of the jar. The body and the waist are sort of from its thickest part all the way down to just above the base, clearly representing the largest volume, right? Because of the circular nature of it. And not surprisingly, almost 80% of the shards we find are from the sides of the vessels. A lot of the lids were wood, but we have found fragments of ceramic lids as well. The wood ones would not have survived the intervening time frame. They would have just rotted. But we do have some ceramic lids, and we have bases, which you can also get a diameter from the bases. And this helped greatly in comparisons with known collections when we were just trying to find out which of the known provenience assemblages was most similar to ours. So that's the distribution by shard type. I mentioned 12 categories of, you know, what these things looked like. And that was based on the color, the paste in the color of the inside broken part. That was the easiest way to change them because it's an amazing amount of difference. And some of them were identical. So we just started grouping the identical ones. And we came up with 4 that had enough pieces, enough fragments, and they were very similar. And we figured, okay, well, we can start working with these. You know, here you see orange and purple. There might have been 3 of those, you know, out of 429 or whatever, the number 426. So you've got 3. It's really not enough to do much with. And invariably, those would all have been wall shards, right? So you have no idea of the diameter, you have no idea with the shape of it. It's just this wall piece. So we decided to take those 4 largest categories: red, brown, light gray, which are the dragon jars, and the dark gray. And we really focused in on those. And here's what they look like. These pieces are extremely good pieces. They've been on display. The first 2 were from the traveling exhibit that INA did, the Mexican Cultural Department. This was in Tecate. So we drove to Tecate and went to the museum and all these really great pieces, which were not still in Ensenada. They're just the boring pieces were there. So they took the sexiest pieces and they made a display for the public. So we had to go there on our way back and I photographed them as best I could, you know, in the display cases. So you have red on the top left, you have brown on the top right. Very similar, almost indistinguishable. The brown tended to be not only brown, but they also tended to be generally thinner. So likely a different manufacturer, but we aren't even sure about that. They could easily be from the same source. And that's eventually what we decided. The dragon jars are by far the coolest in my mind, and the other fragment that was really that was probably the best fragment of the dragon jars. You can see there not only the rim but the neck, the entire shoulders, the embossed dragon in relief, the ears with little heads on them. Very, very well executed, and the glaze is in many cases, still intact. But look at the detail, the scales, the feet, the eyes and the mouth. Some of these were amazingly beautiful. That's a pretty nice one too, actually, in terms of preservation. We call those gray. The one on the lower left also was represented reasonably well. We called that dark gray, I believe. And that one was represented, I think, by about 12 or 13 and that shards, and that's where we cut it off. So based on other scholarship, not what we have done, but secondary sources, it was very clear that the place of manufacture for the brown and the red pottery was Southeast Asia and Thailand. That had been documented previously. The dragon jars came from South China and were well represented in several other assemblages of known provenience. The mainland Southeast Asia Burma collection was pretty clear, as you'll see in the following photographs, that it's almost an identical match to jars that we know were made there. And that's basically what we did. So we tried to compare those 4 jar types with known provenience wrecks that we have a lot of information on. The San Diego was a Manila Galleon just about ready to leave Manila in 1600. They were attacked by the Portuguese, who were, kind of trying to find, maybe, or may even been the Dutch. But there was a lot of infighting in Asia for the right to trade and the right to purchase some of this stuff. So they got into a battle right off Manila, and San Diego, fully loaded, ready to go, was sunk by gunfire. It was since salvaged several times, and there's a whole book on the San Diego. It's very high level of preservation, sank in, the kind of water that you can recover that stuff pretty easily. And there was no passage of time to lose track of where it was. The White Lion was a homeward bound galleon, but it was coming around the Horn of Africa, and it was sunk by enemy fire at St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. But they have, pretty decent photographs of it and a good text description of the stoneware jars. So we used that one. The Concepcion is the number 4 on my original map that showed it on the southern tip of Saipan. And that went down in 1638. So our idea was this: you can't date stoneware. You can tell where it came from, if you have enough of them, to make a case for what kind of a jar it is. The motifs clearly changed over time, but they're so durable, if they last 50 years, there's no precision there. So the best we could really hope for was try to pick 3 wrecks that had a stoneware collection and basically say, okay, we know these things changed over time. If we're trying to get another vector of evidence that shows that the Baja wreck was late 16th century, the hypothesis is that it should be most like the San Diego, right? And least like the Concepcion. And that's really about as far as we were able to take it. But we were very happy to find these pictures all came from the San Diego. And you can see just in this picture, the dragon jars with the relief, the ears with the little faces on them, basically the same glaze. And these pictures don't actually do entirely justice to these, right? Because I can only show four here, but these ears right here, and right below the ears, there's, if you would have a shoulder shard next to it, you could see had 4 concentric rings perfectly aligned all the way around. It's just a design motif, that's all it was. And if you blow up these pictures more than what I've done, you can see that ring right there? Around all of them, those essentially identical to what we find in Baja. The ears are the same. The diameters were very, very similar, both from the openings and the bases. And look at this grouping down here. You see this sort of squared off pattern here. This is a dead match to this piece right here. And the dragon jars, again, very similar. So for the main components of the assemblage, the most highly represented was extremely similar to the San Diego. Now let's go to a picture of the recovery from Concepcion. And this picture did not exist 5 years ago, because I searched the internet thinking I was going to find a picture of something that was from the assemblage. A lot of what I had to work with was reports that had been duplicated multiple times, and you could read the text, but the pictures were not very usable. You couldn't see much detail. And I looked and I looked, and I can promise you this picture was not there. Now you search on the Concepcion 1638, and some of this stuff has been photographed, and it's available. And just the girth, just the overall girth, if this is a representative sample, based on those photographs, it almost strikes me as like an entirely different scale. The openings tend to be really, with the exception of this one, which is pretty elaborately, I can't find my, there it is. With the exception of this one and this one, those are pretty elaborate, but some of these other openings are really boilerplate, right? I mean, not very well executed. They don't even look particularly round. And here's some ears, but some of these openings are pretty plain Jane. Whereas the openings in all of the jars that we have from the Galleon in Baja are pretty elaborate. Notice the owner's marks on this assemblage from Concepcion. The P could stand for paramour, maybe, or whatever. Apparently, you know, if you owned with the contents, you had the right to put your stamp on it, basically. And a lot of these have those on there. There is not one single owner's mark in any of the shards that we have found in Manila Galleon, not one. And no maker's marks. You know, you figure on the bottom, somebody might have, you know, put an X or something like that. Nothing like that. Not a single one. I'd like to find one someday. But clearly, these are all just dead matches. And the distance in time between, you know, the 78, what are you talking about, 22 years? Well within the lifespan of one of these jars. This was an anomalous find, and it is actually probably not technically stoneware. This is an olive jar, an Iberian olive jar. It really is captured in Markham's 2009 book, plate 51, I think it is. Yeah, plate 51, where it is an olive jar opening. An olive jars were ubiquitous in Portugal and Spain, Italy, and they represent European technology. We've only found 3 shards of that type and a rim. But the rim is key because it measures exactly what Markham suggested it would. And there are wrecks of Iberian ships that have thousands of these things on them. So when he says that's what an olive jar looks like, it's really exactly that. But only 1, 2 or 3 shards, you know, likely suggests that the Asian merchants did not prefer them, right? I mean, and this is early on in the trade. This is only 20 years after the initial part of the trade. So there had to be some cross trading of these jars. We know a lot of them ended up in Mexico, but here's just one example that somehow found its way onto an eastbound galleon. But the quantity, I think, is suggestive of how the Asian merchants who had access to these wonderful durable jars, maybe they didn't think they were so hot. We originally had these categorized as Asian earthenware because they kind of crumble in your hands. They're just not as well done, probably low fired. But we've since created the Iberian category. So the conclusions here, as good as they can be with such a limited artifact category where dating is difficult. But what we set out to do was basically try to find something that would even disprove, because we were all talking about this as a late 1500 galleons, one of the early ones within the first, couple of decades of the galleon trade. All the other evidence added up, the markings on the porcelain, all added up to late 16th century. All the metal recovered, it fit. All the coins, coins are pretty conclusive. And they are all minted in the New World. They were all after a certain date when the style changed and the assayer's mark was right there. I mean, all of them have been restored by the Mexican government. They're just a concretion, we get them out of the ground. They all have to be restored. But once they have been restored, it's pretty clear that the coin assemblage adds up to late 16th century. What we didn't want to find, and was why we had to do this analysis, is because if for some reason the stoneware pointed to a completely different century, or if there was inconsistencies that suggested this thing was from 1759, then we would have, probably been pretty disappointed. But since overall the assemblage is most like, by a long stretch, the 1600 assemblage from the San Diego, we feel that the evidence does not disprove the overriding hypothesis that we have a ship from the late 16th century. It's not as airtight as the coins, but it at least doesn't suggest that we're wrong somehow. And that's really what we set out to do. As a separate category of evidence, the stoneware assemblage generally supports that the wreck is from the late 16th century. So I was happy with that. I think others were happy with that. And as we get more shards and we maybe redo the statistics someday, we'll take another look at it. But unfortunately, as I said, nothing has really happened on the project since about 2018. I did email Roberto, the editor of the volume and the leader of the Mexican unit of INA that deals with this particular site, the Subaquatica group. And he said that they hope to go out there later this year. And he didn't promise anything. He was hoped that we could join him, but it's getting to the point now where we would have to start planning for something like that. So we'll hear from him and we can get a small group to go down there and participate again this year. He said drug trafficking was like a big problem. So they don't want to put anybody in danger. The site is not necessarily protected. Like the one at Drake's Bay it's in the national lake shoreline. It's totally protected. If you go anywhere near that place and start picking stuff up and putting it in your pocket, somebody's going to call you on it. So, but that's not the case in Baja, but it's so remote, you'd have to kind of be purposefully going there. And we've tried to keep the actual location pretty out of the public eye. And I think we've succeeded in that. So I'm hoping that means that nobody's down there doing anything by way of looting. The beeswax wreck is even in a more remote area where if you dive in to look for stuff, you'll probably die. So they're not too concerned about people. I mean, just turbulent, nobody goes there for fun. You could conceivably have some fun in the surf in Baja at a certain time of the year, but I'm not sure people would choose to go there. So San Diego it was, and we did our best to find if the stoneware evidence was supportive, and it turns out that it was. So in 2018, excuse me, 2017 in Dallas, Ed von der Porten, Roberto Junco, and Scott Peterson, who's the leader of the beeswax rec in Northern Oregon, put together a symposium where I gave this talk, and others that are in this book, different chapters, gave all their talk. And Springer Press was impressed, and they wanted to do a publication that was kind of the status of research on these 3 rec sites as of that time. And it took a long time with COVID and everything and all the delays to get this volume out, but it came out in 2021, and you can get it on Springer Press. And there are other chapters in there that are, I have my chapter in there, but there's a chapter just on the metal detecting and the metal objects. There's some background sections that talk about, the origins of the Manila Galleon trade. I tried to just summarize those for you today. And there's some other articles in there about the beeswax wreck and the Drake's Bay wreck. So by reading that, you probably get a pretty good glimpse of, the status of Manila Galleon research as of 2017. So I'll take some questions if you would like, if you have any.
You've got that assemblage of the San Diego, the whole pots. Has there been, is there any information about what they were hauling in these things? Were they?
Pretty much everything went in these jars because they could seal them and keep them mostly watertight.
They use wax or something to seal
I've
them?
not seen any wax around the rim. But I think they sealed them pretty tight. Rice, tea, ceramics, right inside, and linens. Don't forget, because we don't have any linens, we don't have any silk. Silk was a big deal in the early part of the Manila Galleon trade. There are stories that the people that lived in the Spanish and the indigenous people after about 100 years of the Manila Galleon trade were walking around in silk dresses. I mean, it was flooding this area. So silk was a huge deal. None of it survived that we've ever found. I mean, it's 400 years, right? I mean, it's a long time. And so we know that silks would also have been stored in these to keep them safe, keep them dry. So everything.
And they're buying it with silver, and of course China doesn't have silver, so then they're making. Do any of these galleons end up with silver objects in them?
I think that
Later they were sending stuff.
they were sending the silver from the Americas to the traders, and I think that was considered money, basically.
So, but the coinage was going like from Mexico, and Spanish and Mexican coins going to China.
Yes.
They melt it down,
Yes.
make whatever, and then send it back.
No, I think they used it as money.
Later, they're sending it back to California.
We've not found any silver
So it must have been
objects
last
other than
year.
coins, but they would have just made the trip both ways. The coins just made the
They're
trip both
probably
ways.
silver
Yeah.
objects on
Yeah, I think they used it as money. I don't know exactly what that little incense burner is made out of. It's clearly metal. But I'm pretty sure it's not silver.
John, there's a question from Lynn and Zoom that says, the Iberian jars possibly suggest food consumption as used by the mariners themselves.
Sure. I think that jar
And store
wine.
of the trip.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe they were going that way. They had them. They probably had a whole bunch of them. But this was an eastbound galleon. So maybe they found, this storage method better and they had more of them. Certainly they were larger. for storage of water and stuff, but I think, I totally think they were used for provisioning.
Yeah, has anybody done like starch grain, I mean, any sort of analysis of what might have been inside?
In any of these,
Yeah.
not that I'm aware of.
I was thinking maybe those whole ones had residue.
Yeah. Well, none of the shards are big enough to have still had anything kind of in them, you know?
Like, what about these guys?
Well, that's
Different.
the San Diego.
Right, but that would give, if there was residue in there, give you an idea of what.
Yeah. I think it's well accepted that they put everything in these jars. Anything that could fit in these jars, because otherwise you what would you put them in to protect them during the voyage? I mean, this is a storage container. And I think everything was put in these jars.
So food as well as.
Absolutely.
Trade goods.
Yes, everything. The storage containers of their day, so to speak. Yes.
Yeah, so sorry, that may have been part of her question, the jar lid was, the olive, the jar was not, resembled the olive jars in the Iberian area, that was on there. Could that have just been for provision for the crew as well, or?
Oh, yeah, yeah, definitely.
And that's what I meant for trading with the people in Manila, but.
Yeah, if they were Spanish, I'm sure they had to have their wine.
6-8 month voyage, they had to eat and drink some.
Yeah. Yeah, what I've read about the
wine
voyage,
is called the safety of the water.
yeah. Yeah, and probably beer too. I mean, some rudimentary fermentation, safe it, yeah. From my understanding that they were so concerned about making a profit, and the crew sometimes shared in the profit. So, they were all on board with making money, that the food was stored on deck. And the valuable stuff was kept in the hold on the way back, and they would just, as they ate it, they'd get more room as things were consumed. But they were more concerned about making a buck than they were of eating well. And that probably was the undoing of a lot of them.
Say they better have some citrus on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's what I think, Peter Von Important was Ed Von Important's grandson, who also worked on the site, had told me something about, they thought that the galleon might have run aground because everybody was really sick or dead from scurvy.
Yeah, they didn't really
get down to Acapulco.
Oh, yeah, yeah. They didn't really arrest scurvy on ships until much later.
Right.
Yeah, so it definitely was probably a case of malnutrition. And scurvy's very, is pretty rough.
Really debilitating.
Yeah. Yeah, especially, that kind of work. If you're not 100%, you're gonna get injured and you're gonna not do well.
I remember hearing some story about them seeing a ship coming into Acapulco, and it just kind of kept right. And they're like, what's going on?
Right,
So they followed it. Everybody's dead.
Yeah.
Scurvy.
yeah, that doesn't
Nobody
surprise me
left
at all.
alive on the ship.
Yeah.
You could crack it open those jars and see what's in there.
Yeah, and my understanding too, I mean, I'm not a ship architectural historian, but a lot of these ships were made in Mexico, right? Because by the time they got around to, if they came all the way around from Spain, a voyage like that, the ship would already be old, or maybe certainly have been stressed out and need to be recaulked or whatever.
Yeah.
So by making them there, they had a new ship. And these ships got bigger and bigger and bigger. Through those 200 years, the ships got way better and they got way larger. Some of the biggest Spanish galleons ever were in the Manila galleon trade, because it was all about bringing back enough merchandise where you could make money
No.
in the market.
So the later the year, the bigger.
Bigger the
in
ships,
general,
yep, and more sturdy. Ed Von der Porten told me one time, he said at the beginning of the 16th century, families used to wave goodbye to their sailor husbands and cry because they probably weren't coming back.
Yeah.
At the end of the 16th century, they were waving because they knew they were going to bring back lots of money and smiling. So I don't know how true it is, but it really speaks to the beginning of the modern era, when technology got better and people started figuring out things like mathematics and and the strengths of things and geometry and how to build a ship properly. A lot of that happened in the 16th century. Because,
No matter how good the ship, you didn't have anybody, you didn't have the vitamin C.
Right.
You're doomed anyway.
right,
So,
well, if you look at replicas of the ships that Columbus took on his first voyage in the late 1400s, and you compare them to a 1600 plus Manila Galleon, the difference in size and durability of the ship is remarkable.
mm,
They basically were lucky they got here, you know,
Yeah.
before that.
Yeah, it's basically, trying repurpose Mediterranean tile ships to these long transit voyages.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they weren't built for those long distances the way the galleons were.
yeah, not in the beginning. They were pretty flimsy. They were pretty
Well,
flimsy.
The shorelines being so rocky without lighthouses. It's
Yeah.
not-
Oh, yeah.
It's like,
Well, you imagine coming through the Channel Islands, for example, you know, even modern ships, you know, in the 20th century have fallen aground there. And then you're talking about a bunch of people exhausted,
Point conception, yeah.
you know, trying to negotiate all that stuff. It was been terrifying.
Well,
It's still remarkable to me that after all that time, you know, San Francisco Bay, the mouth to San Francisco Bay really wasn't discovered properly till much later. And if all those ships, 2 a year, which isn't that many, right? But coming by there, you would think that somebody would have seen it, right? But it really remained, you know, quite a secret for a long time, so.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions that I can help with? If I can.
Any more questions on Zoom?
nobody's speaking up. Karen?
I got a quick question.
Oh,
Sure,
On one of your slides, it looked like you guys are placing units on the beach, is that correct?
yeah, let me go back to it, Dustin.
So when you're placing a unit in like a really active environment like that, where context is not gonna be like it is terrestrially, is there any sort of contextual control you're utilizing? Are you doing arbitrary context? Or what would be the what's the model for placing those units, and how are you controlling the context?
Well, it was pretty standard. Probably 20 centimeter levels, if I remember correctly, at least the ones I was involved in. And the problem is that the wind is so intense that, you know, you're taking the stuff out and the sides are collapsing. It's very thin sand. So it was really hard to do it well. You know, we tried to get behind like a little knoll where we could get away from the wind a little bit and put one down there. What we were really trying to get after is if we could isolate in the sidewall different strata of the beach and say to ourselves, okay, well, this dusty stuff up here, you know, that's just changes every week or whatever. And then below that, there's this layer that has a lot of shell fragments and it's kind of heavy. And then below that, the moisture really starts coming in and, you know, that probably doesn't move very much. And we did document a lot of that stuff. I remember one year we did augers all the way from the water every 2 or 3 meters. And we created a profile based on that. Marco Manichetti and I did that. And it showed that, you know, there's these basically strata that run the length of the entire width of the beach. We had a geologist go down there one time and his conclusion was that the beach actually was very stable. Even though from year to year, that dusty stuff goes all over. And the dusty stuff was anywhere from, you know, 2 inches to 6 or 7 inches, but it covered most of the ground, right? So if you could snap your fingers and just get that upper dusty layer of thin sand off, I bet the recovery would be way more. But you could, you know, it's such a large area when you're walking over it. If you see a blue piece of pottery, you stick your flag and you keep walking. I remember one year somebody brought a snow shovel. Remember those? You know, and they figured they would just gently take it off. And we cleared an area about as big as this room at one point in time, got down to the shelly layer that it was more coarse sand. We didn't find a single artifact that way.
And you said the debris field was like
10 miles long.
for
Yeah.
over 400 years.
Yeah. And it's amazing too, because there's the beach with the dusty stuff. And then you get inland and there are these dunes that are like 15 meters high. And the dunes even have blowouts that go down to the orange sand. And if you can climb over the dune and get into one of those blowouts, you find artifacts. Let me find it here. Okay. So the tall dunes start like right here.
So this stuff is bumped up against.
Yeah, that, for the most part, but then you go inland. I wish I had some more pictures now. But and I remember a lot more than what is shown here, so that must include this here, some of these edge pieces. But you know, you'd go into a blowout that was as big as this room, and you'd have to scour it, and there'd be stuff in there from all kinds of sources, you know, modern stuff. And then you'd find one piece of stoneware. You know, how it got there, I have no idea. I mean, the wind is really strong, but I can't imagine it picking up any of these pieces and throwing it. So it happened over a long period of time.
We have one more question from Zoom, from Lynn. Have you been able to compare these containers to others that were not submerged?
That was.
I know you showed the San Diego ones, would
Mhm.
be like,
You know,
Strong
all the
story.
collections that I've ever seen were from shipwrecks.
mm,
I'm sure there's one that survived otherwise, but think of how many generations that would have had to go through from the 16th century,
Mm.
you know, 20 generations and,
What stuff may be found in China?
from China.
yeah, yeah, we have not compared them. We only compared them to with types where we knew the ones where that are well represented with ones where we knew where they came from. So,
Like the museums, that big museum in Mexico City.
yeah,
Stuff.
yeah, they certainly have some. I've been there, the Museum of Anthropological Museum. I was very disappointed. My wife and I went to Spain in 2019, right before you know what. And when we got there, we were all set to go see the San Diego collection at the Naval Museum in Madrid. So we got to Madrid and I was talking to our Airbnb person and I asked him, you know, where it was and, you know, what bus line I should take to get there, or how long the Uber was going to be. And she said, they're closed. They're closed for remodel.
Oh, no.
So I just assumed, you know, a national museum like that it wouldn't completely close. That there'd be some sections of it open. And when we got there, we were pretty disappointed. I couldn't see them. And I really wanted to see them. We were right there.
Some of the best museums we saw in Spain were just in little towns.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. Well, in Sevilla, you know, where they have a building purposefully built back in the day, for the purpose of administering trade with the Indies. It's called
I forget.
I forget what it was called, but now it's a museum to itself, right? It's become a museum of the Archive of the Indies, I think is what it's called. And when we were there, they had this amazing display all through, and it was open to the public. Sometimes it's not, because it's actually, you know, also an archive that keeps all these old records. And you have to be, you know, a qualified researcher and obviously a speaker of Spanish to be able to go there and make heads or tails of the details. And people are still doing that. We're still turning over documents that might shed light on what ship, whether it's the San Juanillo or the San Juan, you know, maybe there's some reference to it. Actually, maybe it wasn't lost without a trace or whatever. So there's some documents that haven't even been researched yet. So the Mexican group that we work with has sent people there to do research. And yeah, I tried to hint that I wanted to do it one time, and they very politely told me that I had to do better than to be able to order tacos in Ensenada to be able to get into that place. So I couldn't do it.
Your old Spanish wasn't good enough.
No, I'm
Talk Spanish.
my taco Spanish, that's right. But it was an amazing building and again, purposely built. Oh, it was gorgeous.
It's not archived. They're just impressive. The
Yeah.
building across the way, so that's all the good stuff.
Right, right, but they had a display of old documents while we were there that they had brought out for the public, and they were all really well presented. And said some of them had English translations, and it was, you know, this captain was talking about, you know, all of his negotiations to buy things and, you know, Manila. It was amazing. Just so there's tons of that stuff that still hasn't even been researched thoroughly yet. So we're hopeful that eventually there'll be some additional light from the documentary side on what shipwreck this actually is. But until then, we're just hope we don't come across an artifact category that throws our hypothesis out the window.
And you have to be able to translate the Spanish that those documents are written in, which is not.
Exactly.
every Spanish speaker speaks.
Yes, yes. Yeah, certainly better than me, but yeah. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I really enjoy speaking about this particular project. Thank you, Pat, for inviting me, and Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Don.
And
That was
next
wonderful.
month, we have
Oh,
Greg
come-
Castro.
Come tell people here, if you wouldn't mind. Well, I don't know the details.
I don't know any details yet either, but I just know of Greg.
Yeah.
Okay. Hello, so next month we have Greg Castro, well-known Native American activist. He will be coming over from San Jose to speak for us, and I don't know the date off the top of my head. It's the second Thursday of
Next month?
March.
Oh.
Yes, it's the Thursday after the SCAs.
Yeah.
After the SCAs, yes. Yes, so we hope to see you next month, and thanks for coming tonight.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Hey, the heck, that would be held up.
The building is the archives of the Indians.
So,
Very much.
Just hold your jets, listen.
Hey, Pat,
Thank you.
Hey, yeah,
you told